Paul declaring that Jesus is Lord is basically saying that Caesar is not.
Takes what's potential in Paul and then sort of actualizes it.
That there is like this perpetual construction of what it means to be Christian. Yo! Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we can bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And we're going to jump back into our parliamentary book club. Going through Daniel... Is that the one? The parliamentary book club. Going through Daniel Colucciello Barber's On Diaspora. We've gone through chapters 1 and 2. Well, the intro, chapters 1 and 2, in 2 previous episodes over the past month. So go have a look for those if you want to get caught up. But we're going to be jumping into chapter 3 today, where he's talking about a sort of revised understanding or a problematized understanding of Pauline theology from within the framework that he's already established about this notion of like a diasporic Christianity within a framework of immanence. And if that doesn't make any sense, then we'll try to give a brief recap when we get into the main segment, but also go back and check episodes 1 and 2 so you can get caught up. But before we do anything, we want to give a shout out to our sponsors over at Mubi. Mubi is an online streaming service that is unlike those other streaming services. The great thing about Mubi is that they specialize in curating classics from regions all around the world, as well as art films. They do interesting documentaries. They look for films that may have flown under the radar, things that you might not have been familiar with, or maybe that you have been familiar with, but you just didn't really know how to find, like a Wim Wenders film or something like that. Well, the wonderful thing is that Mubi kind of does all that work for you. It's not just a hodgepodge of shit that's thrown against the wall, but rather they curate 30 selected films at a time, and they are offering all of Owls at Dawn listeners a free 30-day extended trial if you go to mubi.com/owlsatdawn. That's mubi.com/owlsatdawn. And Troy's actually going to tell you about a film that is currently in their rotation that he thinks you guys should check out.
Yeah, so I wanted to recommend a film called Project Nim. It's available on Mubi now. It's a film by James Marsh, documentarian. He's done a number of films, probably most notably Man on Wire. Remember that film about the guy who walked across the wire between the World Trade Center buildings before they came down. He also did The Theory of Everything, the Stephen Hawking biopic that came out a few years ago. And Project Nim is about a baby chimp who is in this sort of real life experiment, is able to grow up with human parents and treated like a human child, and taught American Sign Language in order to see how he's able to develop communication skills. And I think it was meant as a challenge to Noam Chomsky's theory that only humans had this innate ability to develop language. I know that it's disputed in linguistic circles as to whether or not the experiment was actually evidence against that thesis, but regardless of that, it's a really interesting take on human socialization and the learning of language and all these issues. And it's also very heartwarming to just watch a chimp be treated as a child. It's a wonderful film. I would encourage anybody who's interested in any of those areas or in human-animal relations or things like that to give it a try. Available on Mubi now.
Sick. That sounds kind of rad. And as I've said in previous spots when Mubi has sponsored us, there are different regional libraries, so make sure you go check out what your regional library is, depending on where you are in the world. Troy is obviously talking about the American library. I'm currently in Australia, so my library has probably got a couple of different films, but there are some amazing ones here. There's films by Francois Truffaut, particularly the film that's called Confidentially Yours. There's the, I think, fantastic film by David Mackenzie called Starred Up. I mentioned Wim Wenders earlier. There is a Wim Wenders film on here. There's also Blackfish, which is that really kind of famous documentary that raised a lot of attention about the, let's say, mistreatment of animals at SeaWorld parks and other similar related aquatic theme parks around the world. So go to Mubi. They are great. Like I said, prestige pieces, independent cinema, classics of cinema, regional films from all around the world. And the way that they do it is by having 30 films in rotation at a given time. So you have 30 days to watch a film. And then when the film drops off, every day a film drops off and a new one comes on that starts its 30-day rotation. So go to Mubi.com/owlsatdawn to get your 30-day free extended trial. Thank you, Mubi. And also we have a Patreon, right, Troy?
Yeah. If you want to go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn, you can support us there. And we have a bunch of different goodies you can access, including bonus episodes, one of which will come out, I'm guessing, coterminous with this episode, about a special topic which is near and dear to my heart, as well as yours, Austin. But I think it's a little bit more of my sort of passion, life's passion.
This is your fanboy material.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. We may even just change this podcast to be no longer about philosophy anymore, but stay tuned for that. You can also access the Democracy Motherfuckers tier, which is where you're able to contribute towards picking a Patreon-sponsored topic for a future episode of the show. We have one going, or a poll going right now, so either if you are a Patreon currently, please go onto the Patreon sites and add your favorite topics to the list. And if you're not a patron, then you can go ahead and go to Patreon, sign up, and then join that tier of access as well.
Yeah, that's right.
But you know what we got to do first, dude, is we got to do the shitty minute.
Ooh.
This is the part of the show where one of us rants and raves about wherever it is that is grinding our gears this week. So, Austin, what's got you down?
All right, so my shitty minute for this week is about a trend. And it's not a disturbing trend, but it's a trend that I have witnessed in online left, and not just online left, but also in the publishing world, environments. And it was actually confirmed to me by a really interesting seminar that I went to this week with a Belgian philosopher named Michel Ferrer and a sociologist named Melinda Cooper here in Sydney. And it was a seminar on progressive publishing. Like how to publish for like popular but also academic outlets today if you're trying to publish like progressive political or theoretical works. And it was so interesting because it really tied into, and I think it's helping me to understand the pet peeve. So first I'll tell you the pet peeve and then I'll tell you about the seminar. So the pet peeve is that I feel like there's actually like a really subtle anti-intellectualism that is very rampant in the left right now. And it doesn't seem like it is because it takes the form of being politically astute and politically concerned with like quote unquote real material analysis to the neglect of like theoretical abstractions or to the neglect of theoretical musings or high theory or the seminar room, as I've seen it called in various different contexts. And what it basically amounts to, from what I can gather, is that the notion of abstraction is used as a derogatory term to basically discredit theoretical musings that don't seem to have immediate, or maybe at all, even down the road, practical application or import. And the reason that I've found it a bit frustrating are a couple of reasons. One, I think all human thought is abstraction, so it seems to be a non sequitur. But more than that, it also seems to valorize certain commonsensical understandings or ways of thinking or domains of knowledge, and immediately serves to discredit those that are foreign, that seem to be abstruse. But what I would contend is that the reason they seem to be abstruse, or the reason they seem to be quote-unquote abstract and purely theoretical, is that they just haven't been they haven't been inculcated into the common parlance. They haven't been inculcated into the realm of the common sense. But then I went to this publishing seminar thing, and one of the things that both Melinda Cooper and Michel Ferrer discussed was how there's been a turn, even in publishing, towards a demand, even at the academic houses. And Melinda edits a series for Stanford University Press, so one of the top 5 university presses. And Michelle is the founder of one of the best trade presses in the world that is distributed by MIT Press that's called Zone Books. So they speak from a relative position of know-how and authority. And one of the things they were talking about was how a large percentage of these publishing houses, both at the academic and trade level, are actually demanding more political and concrete books. And they kind of attribute this to the rise of a sort of greater awareness of political and economic language post GFC, the global financial collapse in 07 to 09, which is a good thing, right? That's a good thing that the average person, maybe because they were introduced to the 1% v 99% or to this understanding of like mortgage-backed securities or whatever because of listening to the news and then being concerned with what were the causes of this financial collapse, people have become more introduced into what was before that abstruse theoretical economic language, but they were introduced in a very through very kind of like popular slogans, but then now people can read a book by like Wolfgang Streeck, Buying Time or How Will Capitalism End or something like that, which have become like bestsellers. They sell tens and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of copies. And, Wolfgang Streeck prior to this is he's a sociologist, and not many people on the street are reading sociological textbooks on like economic history or anything like that, or economic theory. So they said, that's a good thing about that. And they weren't bemoaning this. This is just me now kind of like fitting in my thoughts into this. And I think part of the reason why I've noticed this subtle anti-intellectualism is because the new common sense is geared towards explicit and maybe to the neglect of theoretical, but explicit and concrete political prescriptions and analysis, to the neglect of high theory, to the neglect of like any notion of normativity or seeking the greatest good or the metaphysical questions that have always kind of circled around in philosophical, but even political economic frameworks. Like when you read the early Marx, he's obviously extremely metaphysical, right? So it was really weird. It's kind of like this frustration, and I've been trying to figure out like what is the source of it, and I think the source of it is really it's fucking Jacobin's fault, is what I'm saying. So fuck you, Jacobin. No, I'm kidding. It's because it's a good thing. It's actually a good thing. So this is like a frustration that I've also started to now realize the source to, which doesn't alleviate the frustration, but now it kind of gives me a little bit of a handle on how to assess it further, if that makes sense. So that's my shitty minute.
Yeah, dude. This is very non-rant material. This is very considered and eloquent. I'm not appreciating how calm this whole thing has been. But,
fuck you, Bhaskar, Sankara. You basically turned everybody into a bunch of like political dummies who don't care about theory anymore, and they have no capacity for doing philosophy. Is that good?
I'm just worried that you're setting a standard that I'm not going to be able to meet, because I like to just rant and not have any like linear thought to the shitty minutes. But no, I struggle with the same thing, dude, because what I like that you said that what some people consider abstract is really just unfamiliarity. Right?
That's right.
And that's certainly true. I do think that there's a sense in which the antipathy towards high theory or ivory tower thinking or whatever sort of idiom you want to attach to it, there is something there, right? There's some truth to the fact that, especially in America, academic work is often incentivized not because it has some even theoretical purpose, let alone practical purpose, but because y'all need to publish or you die, right? It's a publish or perish mentality. And that absolutely does produce a lot of work that just doesn't really matter. And it's sometimes navel-gazing and dealing with problems simply for the sake of dealing with problems. And this doesn't necessarily fall into the certain debates being, like in philosophy, we'll call them merely verbal disputes, right? Disputes are debates that are simply about verbal facts rather than about non-verbal facts. That's a different but overlapping kind of territory. So there's some truth to that, right? And I think everybody who works in the academy is aware of that and doesn't want to be contributing towards that phenomenon because you only get into academics in the first place because you love it and think it matters in some respect, right? So I think making people more aware of that and trying to change that atmosphere in the academy is good, but then at the same time, like there's nobody out there who like likes to do this kind of stuff. Everyone wants to do work that's worthwhile and meaningful, and most of their work, at least, is going to be that way. So it's really uncharitable, I think, to just kind of dismiss things as being overly abstract or high theory or whatever. You should have some sort of like hermeneutic of charity there to say, well, what does the author think is worthwhile in this enterprise? And even if we don't want to go down to the author's route, what is worthwhile in this enterprise, even outside of what the author thinks? And I'm pretty confident you can always make a fairly good case that there's something worthwhile there. And even if there's not, the worst case scenario is, okay, there's nothing there, so just don't worry about it.
So then you've worked through it, exactly.
Yeah,
but the point is that this is... There's no effort for that dialectic even. This is just a simple way of establishing that here's the criteria, and anything that is outside of those bounds, then we can have a clear demarcation of what is sayable and what is non-sayable in political discourse. And if you're deemed to be abstract in your thinking, then you are automatically discredited. Now, part of me obviously has like a personal investment into this because I enjoy high theory, and I do employ language that is oftentimes abstract and philosophical. But it's because two things. One, I have some bad habits from studying a lot of continental philosophy, and I'm aware of that. So I'm aware of that, and I'm constantly working through how to translate, if you will, some of these theoretical insular debates and how to translate them into common political parlance. The other problem is I spend a lot of time in academic circles where it is common sense when I'm using these jargon terms, right? But again, that's still feeding into the insularity. So that again is not necessarily a great thing when you're trying to then communicate on a platform like Twitter or Facebook or something like that, right? But then the other problem again is just that that's not always the case, that there is just a sense in which, like for my mom, if my mom read the Communist Manifesto, she would have a very difficult time dealing with some of those themes, you know? Not that she wouldn't understand any of it, because there is a lot of common sense. It was written as a manifesto, but nevertheless, she does not speak the language of politics and economics. Like, that's just not her world. Now, if you go into her world, into the world of design, and into the world of outdoor patio furniture, and into the world of like buying in certain markets, you might, if you're very familiar with the language of capital, you might be like, what the fuck are you talking about with like this pattern and this design and this designer? And so the problem is that there's a relativity of your position, I think, that also determines how it is you determine what is abstract and what is kind of, let's say, accessible or like a genuine material or structural analysis, you know? And I think we need to kind of be patient in that tension of figuring out why it is that this seems to be abstract, why it does seem to be sort of abstruse, why it does seem to be something that is just outside the bounds of what is required for the current political moment in order to manifest programs that are going to immediately produce material benefit. Because we can't just simply engage at the level of technological logic. We can't just become technocratic managerialist Marxists or leftists or post-Marxists or communists or progressives or whatever the fuck you are. Because then you end up just playing the very game of the system that you're seeking to contest. And that's one of the things that is extremely important about like a Marxist analysis in the first place in the middle of the 1800s, because he's precisely contesting the common sense of his day in trying to reground new foundations that have new metaphysical foundations as well. And so similarly, I think if we're going to take up that project and that mantle, which actually I think ties into what we're going to talk about in our main segment here, is that there is a necessary antagonism and contestation to the embedded logics of the system themselves, which means that we have to understand the logic of the system itself and make sure that we're not reproducing it by our very own sort of technological mechanisms.
Yeah, dude, let's use that as a segue into talking about Barber and Paul, yeah?
Okay, you talk about it. You start us off.
All right, so we're starting chapter 3 of Dan Barber's book on Diaspora. This chapter is titled The World in the Wake of Pauline Thought. So just to recap really quickly, the first chapter in the book was on immanence, which is kind of a theoretical, directional chapter talking about how Barber's notion of immanence and interparticularity and co-constitution and all these different terms we talked about back when we talked about chapter 1 are set up, and how the different rival paradigms of philosophy and theology can be situated with respect to that notion of immanence. Chapter 2 talked about the notion of diaspora in Christianity, and about discontinuity and apocalyptic and all these things. And that was sort of, again, introducing more terms and setting the table a bit for getting into Christianity in particular through the advent of Paul's introduction of his theology. And I think a good way to start talking about this chapter is maybe setting the stage a little bit historically about the role that Paul is thought to play in Christian theology. Do you think that's worthwhile?
Yeah, that sounds great, actually.
Yeah, so I think really briefly we can just say that there's a kind of common refrain in maybe secular accounts of religion that Paul is the inventor of Christianity. And it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, right? Because anybody who maybe grew up in the church or has some experience with Christianity, otherwise, if you ask them who invented Christianity, I think the obvious answer would be, well, the one person is named after, right? Jesus Christ.
Right.
But of course, the reason for saying Paul is the inventor of Christianity is in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way is to say, well, whatever Jesus was doing, if Jesus had a sort of religion to him, it was a Jewish religion primarily, right? He saw himself as a Jew. Other people saw him as a Jew. He was called rabbi by his apostles, his disciples. And so he certainly would have seen himself as being Jewish and not separate from that. As much as he criticized sort of the Jewish religion of the time in Palestine, he did it in a way that isn't all that different structurally than, like Jeremiah would have or Isaiah would have. So he's a prophet to the Jews, just as other prophets were, right? Whereas Paul seems to be the one who really creates a break with Judaism. That doesn't mean that he didn't consider himself a Jew, and he didn't necessarily call himself a Christian or call his new sect Christianity, but there's a break with Christianity in that there's a huge emphasis on the Gentiles being involved in this new religion, on moving away from the particular symbols that sort of unified Jews together, like circumcision and the different Jewish rites. And so that's the sense in which it's thought that Paul might be a better object for the reference of the inventor of Christianity than Jesus was. And that means that Paul then is going to be the person you go to when you're asking what's the foundation of Christian theology, right? Since he's sort of the first great thinker of Christianity. Even if Jesus is sort of the first great piece of content for Christian theology, Paul is the sort of creator of it.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say also, I had a really interesting discussion yesterday with a couple of friends after the infamous Zizek and Peterson debate. But we ended up getting into some interesting discussions about these kinds of themes. And there seems to be a difference between like the esoteric and the exoteric between Paul and Jesus, or between Jesus and Paul, let's say. And that Jesus is kind of this esoteric mystic, that he's telling stories that are secret and that are hidden, right? He says, let those who have ears hear. So he tells things in parables, but then there's the bit about him going into the secret rooms with his disciples and explaining everything and saying, to you I explain everything, but you guys have the secrets to the kingdom. So there's this idea that there's still this like esoteric wisdom, or maybe gnosis, kind of like almost like a Gnosticism that a lot of people find still in Jesus, which then seems to kind of fade away in Paul towards the exoteric, towards building systems, towards building theology, towards doing political theology, towards like explicitly trying to make new dogma and institutional frameworks. Christians look to the book of Ephesians, and he's, laying down mandates for how ecclesiology, for how the church is supposed to be ordered. And they look to Corinthians about how it is that like love is supposed to be understood, or you look to Romans and you understand how it is that I'm trying to even think right now of examples, but for example, circumcision in Romans and Galatian, like how are those things? Are those things requirements for the Christian community? Again, ecclesiological, but also it's like other aspects of theology. And so I think that there's something interesting about people trying to see a break here. But what I really like is actually seeing these things as being sort of continuous, even if there is a sort of like discontinuity or rupture, but there's a continuity, and it goes back to, the days when we were in theology, of reading like N.T. Wright in his book, What St. Paul Really Said. And the conclusion is that he basically said the same thing as Jesus. It was just a different sort of expansion upon those concerns to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant, to fulfill the promises of Judaism. So what you see in Paul is a real sort of agonistic effort to find out how to fit this person, Jesus, who he and the other early Christians believed to be the fulfillment of messianic expectations, into those promises that they have carried with them for thousands of years. And so it isn't so much a break so much as it is like a disjunctive synthesis. And for me, I'm so influenced by the work of the New Perspectives on Paul, and Dan Barber talks about it, and that create this kind of like linearity or this kind of continuity, let's say, that for me, I couldn't help but see that throughout as I was reading this chapter. I'm sure you saw that as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes from the fact that, we grew up in with the evangelical interpretation of the continuity between Jesus and Paul, which is basically like they shook hands and Jesus gave Paul the tablets for the epistles of the New Testament.
Right.
And, he just emailed them to him, and then Paul just like forwarded them to the different churches, right?
That's right.
Yeah, which means it basically just kind of covers over the very idea that there's discontinuity there. Whereas the discontinuity is literally in the texts, right? That the Jewish leaders of the church, like Peter and James in Jerusalem, had a beef with Paul and the way that he was interpreting Jesus. And Paul comes from, outside of the apostles. He's not one of the 12. He didn't know Jesus personally. He persecuted Christians and killed them. So he's obviously going to come from a different perspective of a sort, right? There has to be some account of the discontinuity between Jesus and Paul there. And the New Perspective highlighted that for us and said, let's be honest here, there's something here we need to deal with. And then it took that discontinuity and sort of straightened it out, right? Made it rational, made it sensible. It did a really charitable reading of Paul. And that's what I think for us was so just enlightening, right? It just fulfilled all of the sort of intellectual desire for actually dealing with the material in a way that the material deserves, right? Dealing with it seriously rather than just covering it over, but then coming out of it with a complex but rational set of continuities between the gospel texts and Paul's epistles, right? But then that doesn't mean necessarily that everything the New Perspective says is like correct or is good for like universalist politics or even any kind of politics today. I think it just means that it's a good escape route for somebody who has just been told to ignore the very idea of discontinuity from Jesus to Paul.
Yeah, you know what? It was a great escape route for me because I definitely can see a through line in my own trajectory from N.T. Wright and E.P. Sanders and James Dunn, who are the figureheads of the New Perspective, to concerns about pistis Christou and, what was the righteousness of God? What is it?
Dikaiosune.
Yeah, exactly. And the genitive debates and all those things. I can see a through line from that, which talked about the importance of the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, which was that God would create a singular people on the globe, right? Like, I can see how that concern, as manifested in Paul's struggle in trying to figure out how to interpret the Jesus event, how that fits into liberation theology, which then is explicitly concerned with universalism, right? And like the social gospel, which has this like post-millennial concern about like immanentizing the eschaton, about bringing Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem, or bringing heaven into the world here and now, right? I can see how that fits then into liberation theology, which then led me to Karl Marx, which then led me to like my research now in like post-Marxian and various other types of, progressive, radical, political, philosophical thinking. So it is a nice escape route if you are in like an evangelical mindset, or if you have been raised with a certain Protestant mindset. And then even I think if you come from like this secular idea where you think that, Jesus was just this nice ethical teacher, and then Paul is like the bad guy who starts the decline down into like oppressive, dogmatic religion. New Perspective kind of creates a convergence for both of those narratives so that you can have a different way of thinking about universal politics.
That's an important point too, right? We're mostly talking about the account that evangelical Christianity gives for the continuity between Jesus and Paul. But the other one that exists, which I think the two of us only really find out about later, is the sort of secular liberal account, which is that there's radical discontinuity between Jesus and Paul. And Jesus is the good one who has the moral religion we should all follow about loving your neighbor and turning the other cheek and whatnot. And then Paul's the one who turns that into women shouldn't speak and gays suck.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so he institutionalizes it, and with institution comes everything bad with religion, right? So there's a large sort of account of what's wrong with religion in the first place. And even the idea that there's such a universal category as religion. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, right? And the new PP, or the NPP, also sort of converges that, right? And says, well, no, that's not really accurate. There isn't a sense in which Jesus had a moral religion that was completely separate from institutions. And there's not a sense in which Paul fully institutionalizes Christianity and brings out these sort of bad things that we just automatically assume that like Constantine follows from Paul necessarily as like an analytic entailment, right? So yeah, it absolutely collapses both of those things. And even though I think like N.T. Wright obviously is probably a bit more of a conservative than either of us would ever be in almost any area, even theologically, there's absolutely the through line there, right? I mean, the central idea in that kind of thinking about Paul is the neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither man nor woman. If there's ever been a more universalist declaration, I don't know that I know one. And if you take that as the central interpretive, focus of what Paul's thinking, then you're going to come out with a pretty radically universalist program for politics.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that is, I mean, that's kind of like background and stuff circling around what Barber is really kind of addressing here. Those are some of the tensions, I think, that really sort of frame the background of this chapter. Because the real problem for Barber is this problem of community. Because remember, Barber is trying to rethink how it is that we can think of Christianity, how we can use Christianity in ways that aren't just inherited from the Orthodox tradition. And so he has this notion of a diasporic Christianity. So the question is okay, so let's look at Paul now as our next resource. How can we understand the diasporic conception of Christianity? And how can we then understand that idea that seems to be a fracturing within the context of community? How can you have both fracture and community? And for him, that creates, I think, the central paradox that this chapter really is working through. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and I think there's one thesis that Barber has here about Paul. It's that he has the sort of material for thinking the idea of reciprocal co-constitution, or as he calls it in the last chapter, interparticularity. But he doesn't fully fulfill that potential. He goes
Paul doesn't.
Paul does not fully embrace that. And what we should do is, in a sense, celebrate the antagonism at the heart of Paul's account of Christian theology against the world. Right? That antagonism is good, but go further than Paul did and sort of almost like ontologizing that antagonism rather than just like sort of I don't know what you say, maybe like particularize it or just compartmentalize it into this one aspect and then basically continue on as if it never happened.
Yeah, here's a quick little quote. He says, "So it's not about a question. It's not a question of reclaiming a purified Paul, but rather of understanding the tensions intrinsic to his thought and then constructing new decisions on them." So this goes to this idea of signification and expression that we find from his first chapter. That this process of new decisioning is the expression of immanence that is sort of, let's say, oh God, what is it? I keep, in my mind, I keep seeing when I'm thinking about like this, his notion of like the form that is diasporic, I picture like static, like from a TV, like white noise, but like the lines of totality are static. Does that make sense? Like they're shaking rather than it being like a solid totality that's what Christianity is, but that rather his notion of Christianity is one where even the boundaries are sort of like shaking. And
okay, yeah.
And you see what I mean? I'm trying to articulate what that means, but in my mind, Like that's kind of for some reason like a visual picture that always comes up, and I don't really know how to think of it. But that seems to be what he's trying to do here. Is these new decisions are decisions that are new significations. They're new developments of meaning and order, and let's say theology, but also political thinking that can enter into, that can become a part of the perpetual construction of Christian community as a diasporic entity or as a diasporic disposition to the world that can open us up to new conceptions of universality, new conceptions of global politics. And that I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think the most important part for me is to realize that Barber's not simply saying, hey, I have this new idea that comes from like some kind of theoretical lineage from Spinoza to Deleuze, and I'm going to like shoehorn it into Paul here and make Paul say something he doesn't want to say because, you know what, oh, well, Paul made a mistake, I'm going to fix it for him, right? He's not the mechanic coming into some car and then this like affixing parts to it to make it like, to give it like nitrous oxide so it can just like speed up and be badass on a street race or whatever, right? He's saying, no, the materials were already there. They just weren't utilized, or they were utilized part of the way, or they were utilized just for this one portion of the car when actually we can utilize it for the whole thing, right? And if we do that, we can actually improve upon and do better than Paul did, but not in a way that sort of bastardizes Paul. And it since takes what's potential in Paul and sort of actualizes it. And so I don't, even though he goes at great pains to say, you know, we're not trying to find the original meaning of Paul. We're not trying to interpret Paul necessarily. There's some sense in which I think he's being more, he has more fidelity to Paul than he might want to let on, just because I think he obviously wants to stay away from the idea of like, you know, revisiting Paul and discovering the new meaning, which is, I guess, probably given the time that this was published, 2008, 2009, he didn't want to be like another new book about recapturing the meaning of Paul, the mysterious meaning of Paul, right? He wants to distance himself from that sort of set of literature, right? That doesn't mean that this is just using Paul for his own sake, like a Zizek or a Badiou is probably guilty of doing, and I'm sure that they're fine with being guilty of doing that.
Yeah, I was actually just going to mention Badiou's book on Paul. So for people who don't know, philosopher Alain Badiou wrote a book on Paul. What's it called?
St. Paul?
It's just called St. Paul, yeah? Okay. Yeah. And it's basically his using Paul, the Pauline event, right? Or Paul as a thinker of the Christian event, I should say, to sort of like buttress his own theory of the event as this transcendent other that breaks into the fabric of an established world. But I do find a lot of that in Barber. There's a lot of resonance there. There's cross-resonance. So I feel like there is... But I mean, again, Badiou isn't the only thinker that has thought that way. Throughout this chapter, Barber is quoting Jacob Taubes, who I'm not as familiar with, but I do know that he comes up a lot in like this type of political theological thinking. Are you familiar more with Taubes?
Yeah, I read his book on Paul's Epistle to the Romans like way back in the day, but I don't remember a whole lot of it. It's fairly scattered. I don't remember too much.
Is he a thinker of the apocalypse?
Yeah,
is that kind of
definitely apocalyptic? Yeah.
Okay.
I think he was kind of the originator of this whole Paul as apocalyptic thinker rather than Paul as institutional thinker. General idea. Although I'm not super familiar with that literature, I think that's the basic idea.
Okay. So it's in this section. Oh, I guess it's the first section here. But he's basically working through how it is that Paul is contesting the powers, right? Which is what are the powers that Taubes is Paul? How do we understand them? And it has to do with a relationship between law and like discontinuity and Jesus's contestation to the law. But does that mean that there is no law? So he's kind of like working through how it is that we understand this event, this disruption that breaks itself into a pre-established framework that was a sort of continuous framework, right? And one of the things that I thought was interesting, he says is, so the particularity of Paul's political theology, founded as it is in Jesus, should, according to my eminent diasporic account of Christianity, figure in not just as the founding instance of a new universality, but also as a different way of being universal, namely by being interparticular. And I thought this was so interesting because this is a new interpretation of conversion. This is a new way of understanding how it is that the Pauline political theology, as an imminent diasporic account of Christianity, opens up a new way of being universal. And it's not a new image of universality that precedes you, that is a totality that you then emulate yourself and subsume yourselves under, but rather, because that would be like the sort of imperfect nihilism that we talked about in the Prozorov book, I think, but rather it's a sort of transformation of your disposition that then flows outwards in a sort of constructive or expressive and then imminent motion or flow that itself is then diasporic and then creative in its potency. And I thought that was really interesting because then he ties this into the idea of the Christ event, how Christ comes from beyond, and then the follow-up to this section before he starts going into what he calls the 4 ambivalents, or the 4 points of ambivalence. He says, here's another quote, "The universal of the world is opposed in the name of the universal from above." So Paul declaring that Jesus is Lord is basically saying that Caesar is not, right? I think that's a famous New Perspective on Paul line, isn't it?
NT Wright, so yeah.
It is NT Wright, right? Yeah. And so whenever you say Jesus is Lord, you're simultaneously contesting the earthly rule of Roman Caesar. And so the universal of the world is opposed in the name of the universal, quote, from above, despite the fact that this latter universal, the one from above, is founded in particularity and in the world. So political theology becomes less a way of being politically within the world, which is differential composition, and more a way of being politically against, because ontologically beyond the world. And then his last line here is, political theology becomes transcendent. And I thought this was interesting. So what you have is the world as constituted, you have an antagonism, but it's a transcendent antagonism, but it's also a necessary antagonism, that for Paul, his theology is necessarily antagonistic. Therefore, it is qualitatively different than the powers of the world, and thus it is constitutively antagonistic in its moving forward in the development of a community that itself is constituted in antagonism by distancing itself to the constituted powers of the world. And so I thought that there was a lot of Badiou here as well, because the idea of the subject position is something that is created in the antagonism to the powers of the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long time since I read the Badiou book, so I can't remember if it's a little bit more tied to being an event or to his later stuff in Logics of Worlds. I'm assuming the former.
Maybe I'm conflating all of them into one. I don't remember either.
Yeah, we talked a bit about the differences there in the last episode. We talked about a bit how Barber is responding a little bit more to being an event than Logics of Worlds, and that I thought maybe the Logics of Worlds stuff would have been another category of options to sort of reformulate the idea of apocalyptic. But that being said, maybe to make a little bit more sense of this, we can go back to that sort of key idea of Paul of the neither Jew nor Greek, right? Paul says that you're neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, nor man nor woman, but all are one in Christ, right? So he's saying we're erasing all these differences that used to exist between people, right? But I'm introducing a new universal that applies to all those, or covers all those differences, or erases all those differences. And that's being one in Christ. And so I think Barber's absolutely right to say that Paul's introducing a transcendent universal, right? This is a universal that comes out of nowhere. It's not already within the world, right? It's not like you're not a Jew nor a Greek, you're all Greek now, right? It's not from within the world. It's from totally outside. It's totally alien. It's totally new.
If it was you're all Greek now, then it would have been the imperfect nihilism, right? Where you take the particular that is contingently constituted and then you inflate it to the status of the universal.
Yeah, so this is absolutely a kind of universalism in that sense. And what Barber's, I think, basically saying, to keep it very simple here, I don't think the claim is all that complicated. He's just saying, look, we can sort of have this antagonism with the world, but then sort of put it into the world, right? The antagonism was the friends we made along the way. It's not the end result. That was supposed to be a joke.
Well, in my mind, I was laughing. Don't worry.
Yeah, the antagonism is actually intrinsic to the relations in the first place, right? So it's something like we're neither Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free, but we're kind of becoming Jew, becoming Greek, becoming Christian all at the same time. So it's sort of using that idea of the antagonism, but rather than making it a transcendental focus here, it's ontologizing it, right? It's making it part of being itself. And that end concept is the concept of interparticularity, right? Or in some sense, being is becoming.
Yeah, because he does, and I don't remember where it is in the chapter, but he does talk about this idea of, it's kind of very Kierkegaardian, that there is like this perpetual construction of what it means to be Christian, right? That it's sort of something that isn't pre-disclosed to us, but that rather the community is kind of creating that by taking on this mantle. So there's a constructive project here.
Which is what Paul does, right? He does a constructive project of sort of conceptualizing this new universal. Well, this Christianity thing's totally new, whatever he's talking about. So we got to construct it, right? How can we construct it? Well, using the materials we already have and sort of deconstructing and then reconstructing them. And Barbara's point is we can keep doing that. In fact, the radical potential of Paul is to never stop doing that.
What was that last bit?
Yeah, the radical potential of Paul is to say we can do that reconstruction and deconstruction and never stop doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've been talking about this name N.T. Wright for people who aren't familiar. He is I guess he's categorized as a New Testament scholar, but he's kind of a theologian / pastor now more than anything, or not pastor, but is he because he was for a bit the Bishop of Durham, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I don't know if he's still. I don't think he is anymore. But anyway, so but I think now he's just a pastor. But he's written a bunch of books. N.T. Wright, or Nicholas Thomas Wright, I think is his full name. But he has this kind of idea that I kind of always liked, that helped me a lot when I was younger, because when you are raised in the evangelical world, you're basically taught that the canon is set down. It ends at the book of Revelation, that it was literally breathed out by God, and it's handed to us, and it's just our job to kind of like perpetually subsume ourselves under the infinite riches that are contained therein, right? We infamously had a teacher at our university who was really interested in like deconstructive theory, but what was the famous line that he said? You can deconstruct every other text, but
except for the Bible,
which deconstructs you.
Yeah.
Right?
Special pleading much?
So that's the environment that we were accustomed to. And I think that most people think when they think of Christianity, even the non-Christian types, they think that, oh, Bible thumpers, this is how they view the Bible, right? N.T. Wright actually presented an alternative perspective on the Bible that I thought was really interesting. He says it's like the theater. He says it's like a 5-act theater where we're given the first 3 or 4 acts, and then it's our job to create the 5th act. Now, there is some interesting, like you said earlier, he is more conservative than either of us are, theologically and maybe politically and theoretically probably. But there is something interesting, again, in this idea of things are handed down, and then especially from Paul's perspective, Paul is given maybe like the first act, and then he's like, all right, I got to create the second act here. How do I keep writing? Like, the authors of the first act died. I've inherited this IP. I've been commissioned by Disney now to write the next installment, so I'm writing the next one. And then all of a sudden, now it goes to the next person, and the next person has to write. And that's kind of the idea, that there is this perpetual need for construction, for constitution, for development. And it isn't this nice, progressive, linear unfolding of something that was already contained all in the first bit. It isn't this nice, like, the causal mechanism is fully loaded and all we have to do is just like rolling out the red carpet where you just have to unroll it and it just folds. Like, all the potential is already established. There isn't that kind of causality. It's rather this process of imminent creation that Barbara establishes that is discontinuous and continuous, that is apocalyptic and disruptive, but that there's also some attachment to tradition. And it's that tension that I think is really interesting when we think about how it is that we understand what we can do with Christianity as a sort of resource at hand.
Yeah, I like that. I don't really remember that from reading N.T. Wright, but I think the way Wright would interpret that notion of the New Testament as sort of like the theater, and you finish the last couple acts of the play, he would probably interpret that fairly conservatively, right? And be like, well, there's a certain set of things that follow from that, and it's not determinate what they are, but there's a certain set of things, and you kind of have to find yourself within it, and if it's discontinuous with that set of things, then the story doesn't make sense, right? Whereas I think Barber's going to say, no, the first 3 acts were kind of chaos, but not in a bad way, in a good way, in a way that has actual potential, that we're kind of making a crazy Gaspar Noé art film here. So who knows what the fuck is coming next? So you probably have a much more open-ended interpretation, even though they'd probably both agree with that metaphor. You think?
Yeah, I do. I do think that's the case. And then what I would suggest is I don't think that Barber is coming along saying, but I am the one who's going to introduce this cap on chaos. I think he's kind of saying, no, there's a sort of productivity in chaos, and that's what thinking from immanence, one, recognizes, and then two, allows for. It recognizes that there is this perpetual creation, contestation, disjunction. There's a frazzling. Ooh, that's a good word. It's a frazzled. You know that when I was talking about the borders, they're like a frazzled border. It's frazzling. Does that make sense?
Like when you wake up in the morning, your hair.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that I think that even what he's saying moving forward, that we're still going to be working through that tension that is endemic to reality, I think is what he would say. That is endemic to immanence, that is endemic to the process of expression and signification, the process of doing political theology, to figuring out what meaning is and how it is that we order our lives, that it will always be a sort of discontinuous, apocalyptic, diasporic endeavor.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue to the second half of this chapter, where Barber talks about the 4 points of ambivalence that he finds in Pauline thought. So kind of using this idea of the discontinuity inherent in Paul's thought about the antagonism with the world, and taking 4 different concepts and sort of seeing where we can find that potential for discontinuity, and then go beyond what Paul was able to do, or Paul was willing to do. And those 4 areas are people, love, chaos, and the world. And I don't know if you want to just jump around or go through all 4, but I think wanted to talk about, we talked a little about chaos already, and the idea of chaos is a positive thing for Barber, whereas there's some sense in which Paul and those following Paul, he even includes Yoder here, take chaos as just an inherently kind of bad thing and want it to be managed via something like the catechon, right?
Right.
Where it's seen that and a whole political lineage follows from that, right? But I especially wanted to talk about the idea of love. Barber says in here somewhere that love is defined as the decentering of the self in favor of reciprocal co-constitution with the other. I thought that was really interesting because it jives with a number of sort of more theoretical notions of love that you hear. Something about allowing yourself, or being willing and open and vulnerable towards letting yourself be developed or constituted by somebody else. And the opening up to love is in some sense that, right? I know Bedjus has some similar things in like that book In Praise of Love that he wrote a decade or so ago.
Yeah, he says something about how love is the transition from seeing the world as one to seeing it from the position of two.
Yeah. And Barber's notion here is that what we should do is take this notion, which is kind of inherent to Paul, and say it's also true about the whole community and not just the individual. And he thinks that this is sort of already potentialized in Jesus' declaration for enemy love, right? To love your enemy, since it's one of my favorite things that Jesus ever says is you should love your enemy because don't the worst people in the world love the ones that love them back already. So how are you special? I love that, right? Because it totally just like smacks you in the face. It's something you don't really realize until you think about it. But yeah, even like the people that I dislike the most in the world probably love like their family and the people who love them back. So am I really any different than that? It's a great line. And this idea of love being applied to the community, I thought was really important because it's basically saying not only should you individually love your enemy, but your community should love your community's enemy. And for Barber, that means allowing that kind of reciprocal co-constitution, not just of the other, but of the others against your community. And that goes back to, the notion of diaspora, right? And allowing yourself to be constituted by, as if you're in diaspora in some alien land. And I thought that was a super interesting way of getting at the sense in which Barber says, we already have the potential for this in Paul. We're just bringing it out and using this notion of interparticularity to flesh out what it would actually be. And it's totally radical and totally against the grain of, I think, sort of kind of common Christian thinking. Because it really is the notion that, the antagonism happened and it's over and now we're all about stasis. Right? That I think is a really good way of reading the way that Paul's taken by most Christians today, whether they're liberal or conservative.
Yeah, this goes to the tweet that I sent out in anticipation of this episode. And it's kind of this long section, but I'll read it real quick. It's in many ways, this Pauline injunction echoes Jesus' declaration of enemy love. If the I perfects itself in relation to a we, then it is difficult to see how love can be anything other than limitless. Unless, of course, the we is not universal, but instead located within the bounds of the Christian community. And then he goes on, so we'll just put an ellipses there, ... Then he says, in other words, is love the way of being solely for those who are inside the Christian people? Or is it something that, precisely insofar as it is directed outside, that it irreducibly problematizes the very notion of an inside? And then he says, again, ellipses, then he says, love demands a differential form. It cannot be identitarian, for a we necessarily exceeds its own reflexive sedimentation. It is intrinsically excessive. I fucking love that.
I literally highlighted that in the book and said to myself, Austin's going to talk about this.
I fucking love that so much. He has another quote right here. He says, to make one's identity contingent upon diasporic composition with the other is to put identity at risk. To foreground identity is to make diasporic composition impossible. Paul seems to wager on the side of the former, that idea of subjecting identity to contestation itself. Now, I'm thinking not just in terms of like the religious community, which is where people can think of right now, right? Like yes, you insulate yourself, you hunker yourself down, and then of course, all the passages about loving your neighbor and all this other stuff can just be interpreted, it's about just loving the people who are in your church and sacrificing yourself to people who are already converted. They're already a part of the community. And your relation to the outside is one still of contestation and suspicion because they're potential future members of the community. They have the potential to be redeemed, but at the moment, they're your enemy because they're not part of the community. And so it just reproduces this inside-outside formula.
Or also, just to add to that really quick before you go on, it could also be enemy love means making the other like me, right? Not necessarily just treating them with suspicion, but especially if I'm a person who's in a privileged or powerful community, and the others are sort of underprivileged or sort of on the exterior, on the margins, I can just try to make them like me, which is another way in which I think like enemy love can be bastardized into this actually really horrible and kind of violent relationship with others.
So I know this is a very sort of sticky subject, but I also can't help but think about current debates around identity politics in this as well.
Oh yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
So there is a, let's say, violent form of identity politics that is precisely what you just said, that person is an enemy. They can potentially become a part of the community, but there is a requirement for violence in order for that to take place. So the question is how do we understand the contemporary landscape of identity politics within this like inside-outside formula that Barber is establishing, and then think potentially along this more radical political theological notion of just dissolving the notion of interior-exterior altogether. How do we think about that? And I'm going to let you talk about this because I don't want to get myself in trouble.
Well, I want you to talk in a minute about exactly how you're thinking about it relates to identity politics. But I was thinking specifically just about some of the debates around nationalism that are happening today. And that's only tangentially related to identity politics. I guess not tangentially. It's just like kind of the reverse of the liberal id pol focus is this idea of the national identity, which is intrinsic, right? One earns it through birth, pretty much, right? And it forms oneself, and it's totally static and cannot change and cannot evolve. And there's a notion in which, nationalists are willing to allow conversion, right? But it has to be whole conversion from other into same. And that's, of course, violence. And I think anybody who's not on the right sees that as being horrific, right? But this usual solution to that isn't something like what Barbara's talking about. We radically change the very idea of what identity is. Identity is, reciprocal co-constitution with the other. The sort of liberal solution seems to be more like, no, we just have these, multifarious identities, and they can change, and we can choose them, and we can take them on and put them off, to use like a kind of, Judith Butlerian notion of performance. And while I think that that's better than the kind of right-wing nationalist type of identity politics, and there's definitely more of a truth to it. There's certainly a sense in which identities do change, right?
Right.
What Barber's asking for here is even more radical than that.
Yes.
Because he's basically saying not only do identities change over time, and not only can we, in some sense, voluntarily, or in some vague sense voluntarily, change them and adjust them, but we don't even have a stable identity in the first place. There is no single identity that a person has, or even a single set of identities that a person has.
And that's what's crucial for understanding Barber's framework here. He's not just talking about whether or not there are different identities. He's talking about the conditions under which these emergent identities themselves, the conditions under which they are allowed to even contingently express themselves. And it's the fact that there is this immanence that is perpetually constructive, that is beyond them, that conditions them, which means that there is a contingency to these identities that needs to be recognized, but not just simply in the Butlerian sense, but even more than that, for understanding maybe the transcendental conditions that allow for them in the first place, that there is excess constantly at the margins. And it is then attesting to that excess that allows for identity construction to be productive perpetually. And so the problem with maybe sort of certain tendencies within liberal identity politics is when it rejects that perpetual constructionism, when it hunkers down into its silo as though the identity that's constructed therefore becomes a universal. That's when it can then fall into the pit of a sort of nihilism that, in Prozorov's term, or in Barber's terms, that's when it can foreground identity that makes diasporic composition impossible, as he says. And I think that's something that's really interesting. And I'm not going to make like a causal connection between identity politics and this next thing, or necessarily between like blue labor concerns and this next thing. But immediately after this section, he then does talk about like just war theory, and I thought this was also a really interesting section. Did you like this section?
Yeah, definitely.
And the reason was because basically most people think that, and he talks about Reinhold Niebuhr here, who it's this idea that there is some sort of tragic compromise in the Christian declaration, that they talk about peace and they talk about turning the other cheek, but at the same time, so many Christians are all about supporting, like, I don't know, think about the neocons, all about supporting American imperialism because it's in the name of democracy, or, the Judeo-Christian Western civilized concerns, or something along those lines. And then he says, but actually, that sort of idea, there isn't really a contradiction there, but actually there's this who is it? Is it Bell? What's his first name? Is it Daniel Bell? Daniel Bell, who says that actually that there's a sense in which the advocacy for just war fits really into like that Žižekian line, where actually no, it's that if God exists, then those who are subsumed or that who have access to and control over that God can justify anything as long as it's in the service of that larger vision. So there's really no contradiction there. It actually fits kind of perfectly to explain a lot of these tensions. So again, once you have this fixed interior and all of the attendant responsibilities and potentials contained within it, and then that means that as long as you can use that as your regulative principle, then anything you do also is kind of justified coming out from that, in service to that. And I think that's one of the possible expressions or risks that Barber finds in identity constitution that is foregrounded to the rejection of this diasporic composition that he's advocating. And I thought that was kind of a really interesting way for me to understand, or just to solidify my understanding of how it is that Christians are so in their zealotry, that they're so supportive of like American imperialism, which seems to be counterintuitive, or that seems to be a contradiction to the messages of love and turning the other cheek and peace and things like that in the Bible. So I thought that was really powerful for me as well. And it's not just Christians. Like, you could also apply this to Stalinism and how it is that they justify their invasion of Hungary in 1956. Well, it's because they're the ones, again, that hold the regulative principle about what is right and what is wrong and what is sayable and what is unsayable and what we can do and what we ought not to do. And as long as you are in control of that, then you can basically justify anything insofar as it's serving that formal idea that you've foregrounded ahead of time.
Do you think there's a sense in which Barber's kind of saying that modern or contemporary Christians want to deal with the content of the gospel, but not the form? Whereas he's saying that the form is the important thing to, or should be the important thing to recapture, and the content only sort of follows from the form?
He says something about that in chapter 2. Remember? Where he says something along the lines of, the concern here is that the form of Christianity is itself disjunctive or diasporic, and that's the problem, is if the form is wrong, then that means that the content will be wrong in a way, right?
Yeah.
And so this is why it's a very Deleuzian project, because Deleuze develops this thing called transcendental empiricism. It's not just a bland empiricism that's just simply concerned with like a positivist, immediate interpretation of sense data, which would be the content of a thing, right? That you're looking at like bits of information and then you scale up to an aggregate and you make an inference. But transcendental empiricism recognizes, okay, that there's something extremely important about the empirical project of David Hume, for example. But simultaneously, there's also something really important about the Kantian project of formal investigation that conditions the content. The difference is that for Deleuze, the individual significations are co-constitutive with the formal, and that the formal, this relationship of part to whole in mereological terms, isn't one that is like subject to Russell's paradox, because the form itself is also malleable. It isn't a totality. It isn't a world of all worlds, but it's sort of this frazzled barrier that itself is constantly in processual flow based on the shift in significations taking place as its constitutive parts that produce events. And those events are primarily the shifts in the significative constitutive components of the quote-unquote totality. But it's not really a totality. It's a sort of like diasporic formal framework. Does that make sense?
And that's basically just an explication of difference preceding identity, logically, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
identity is constituted by difference.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And it's good because it's helping me, as much as I've struggled with understanding the idea of transcendental empiricism, situating it within this locus here that Barber's doing is helping me conceptualize how that works in practice.
It's strange. I almost feel like if someone is like, hey, how do I understand Deleuze? I kind of want to be like, it's going to sound weird, but read this book on Christianity. you know?
Yeah, exactly. It's working. It's having that effect on me personally, working through this book. But really quick, to get back to the four ambivalences, something you said before you started talking about Deleuze and transcendental empiricism there. This is really helpful, I think, the way that Barbara has sort of schematized the book so far, because it's really helping me understand where I think I track and where I don't track with the Deleuzean project. And especially with regard to this idea about identity politics and how it fleshes out in that way. Because I'm seeing where the effects differ or the conclusions differ from my own, and I can trace that back to its origins. So the basic idea, it seems to me, is that if we're going to kind of map this onto contemporary politics, right-wing nationalist identity politics is this sort of violent originary universalism in the classic sense, right? It wants to sort of take every other and violently and involuntarily transform it into itself. And I think everyone else sees that as being as ugly as it is, right? The sort of left version of identity politics that's in response to that is to just kind of destroy the very notion that there is a universal identity, right? And I think what Prozorov would have called that like passive nihilism, right? Just give up on the idea that there is this universal project.
The former is active nihilism, because I would say that the difference is that it kind of also recognizes, well, it can come in two different forms. It can either be the imperfect nihilism, where it takes a regional particularity and then inflates it to the status of the universal. But really, that's not what they do. Like the people like Steve Bannon and Richard Spencer, they're like, we're cool if black people are around, but they can just have their own communities, right? This is Western civilization. This is European culture. So it isn't saying, at least they're paying lip service. They probably are assholes, even more assholes than they already are. So I'm not trying to soften their criticism. But the idea is that, no, like, we just kind of want to have our own little world. And so then what you have is this kind of recognition that there are these competing narratives, like the sort of liberal identity, political passive nihilism. It's just that it's the active will of the people, right? That sort of Nietzschean active nihilism, that Carl Schmitt, the will, or Leo Strauss, who I'm not as familiar with, but my friend Darius has kind of introduced me to. It's that idea of the active will that is what can characterize that nationalism as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Schmitt calls it decision, right?
Yeah,
politics originates in an active decision. And I do wonder a bit about if we're creating a distinction where there is no difference with that. I'm not sure that universalist project has ever really been that different than it is now. But it's neither here nor there. And the issue that Barber et al. Would have with the left version of the identity politics, right, which is in response to this growing nationalism, is that it wants to have these little particularities, right, and these little sets of identities that group together according to how they overlap. But that's not going to, politically at least, that's not going to actually, defeat the right-wing nationalism. And it's also just doesn't actually get to the accurate internal representation of what individual human beings are, or even individual communities, right? And instead, we need to think even more deeply about the antagonism. It's not just that individuals have multiple identities which overlap, but individuals are constantly having their identities co-constituted by everything else around them. And there is ultimately difference at the heart of their identities, and not just a single static or even multiple static identities. And I think my issue ultimately is, while I think it's right in its critique of the sort of leftist identity politics, and that I think it's correct that we aren't this set of identities which kind of flow and change over time, I don't think that the answer to that, at least as of now, is any sort of theoretical or set of theoretical concepts which leads us to this reciprocal co-constitution idea. Because some reciprocal co-constitutions are bad. I don't want to be co-constituted with a virus. That's bad. I don't want to be co-constituted with the local Nazi group, right? I mean, we're right to oppose that idea. And it's not just because they have the wrong idea of their identity, right? I mean, if Barber is right, then basically everybody has the wrong idea about their identity and their identities, plural. So any sense of reciprocal co-constitution or interparticularity is always going to be with other people who don't have a good grasp on their own set of identities or how they're changing, right? So
listen, motherfucker, you're trying to sneak in some meta ethics here. I can feel it.
Well, yeah, I think it's important just to say that if the outcome is this reciprocal co-constitution idea, and there's no sense embedded in which we can judge which of those is good and which of those is bad, I think this is a good theoretical enterprise, but I think it's very clearly missing something if it's missing that. And I think
I agree.
What it's missing is missing internally. It's not just something we have to add to it. I think it's some kind of gap within the concept itself or the set of concepts itself. And I'm not saying that I have a really good critique yet, but this is just kind of what I'm thinking actively right now about this. And it's really good because this is such a helpful way of sort of forming thoughts, right? Having this antagonism with the text and being like, this is really good. I think the criticisms it's making are so on point. It's so relevant, even though it's not even written particularly about politics, right? And political identity. And you're wrestling with it, like Jacob wrestles with God, right? And that's the most productive way. Deal with text. I'm not like disparaging this text at all. But I do think that's the thought that's being spurred in me right now through reading it and through reading this chapter especially.
Do you think, because I don't disagree, I think that the understanding the normative criteria that conditions the very potential for co-constitution is a crucial element to this entire project that he hasn't addressed yet. I don't know that he will in this text. I don't know that that's his point in this text, but I like that you're noticing that, because for me, this goes to the heart of my book that's going to be coming out. By the way, motherfuckers, my book's coming out in July. I'll tell you guys about it soon, but this is one of the things that I am concerned with because I agree with you. And so what I wonder is, and I'm a little bit more optimistic about the Deleuzian project, about being able to provide a possibility for meta-ethical considerations or for normative frameworks. This is what I refer to in my book as like the future images, right? These hyperstitional images that themselves are subject to the co-constitutive expressive project of immanence. Because that's why it's a transcendental empiricism, rather than just some sort of empiricism or a transcendental project in like the Kantian sense, is that the element that is transcendental, I think, does allow for us to think about those normative frames that structure the boundaries of the potential or the relations of co-constitution itself. And so I do think that within the Deleuzian project, at least I think this is what we could do with the Deleuzian project. So maybe what Barber's doing with Christianity, maybe I am trying to do with Deleuze, and maybe I think other individuals have as well. I think that you can allow for a disjunctive and itself diasporic meta-ethics to serve as a crucial component to the larger transcendental empirical project. But the problem is that it's not foregrounded meta-ethics, right? It's that even in the pursuit of investigating those meta-ethical frames, of investigating the normative, that even that itself is a fraught procedure. And I know that might seem unsatisfying because you're not standing on solid ground, but there is something essentially unsettling about this diasporic transcendental empirical project.
Yeah, I think this is just sort of my intuition, and I don't have really good grounds yet for this, but it does seem to me like these notions of interparticularity and differential co-constitution act more as tools, right? Especially tools of critique. And I think I talked about this a lot with the Prozorov book as well, right? With sort of using these notions more as tools of critique than as actual building blocks for a universalism. And again, I think it comes back to this idea that the normativity is not at all foregrounded, and I don't see how normativity becomes a a sort of accidental consequence of one's philosophy. I think when you do that, it doesn't work out. But that's my intuition, and I'm interested to see how that fleshes out, both in sort of this book, obviously, in the immediate sense, but also talking more about this with you and seeing how that fleshes out. Because my intuition is skepticism, but intrigued skepticism, the good kind of skepticism, right? Which makes you want to find out more.
It's philosophy. It begins with wonder or puzzlement, right? Dude, I just got really excited with thinking about the next few years with us working through these things. I mean, hopefully we continue with the podcast and maybe we'll write something together. I really would love to do that at some point. But I really got excited because I do feel like our interests are both divergent and convergent at a really interesting point of tension. And I think that this is going to create some really fun work in the next few years, especially with your future plans that you have on the horizon. And then considering my project that's kind of going into a little bit of a different direction, with being concerned with like financialization and things like that. But nevertheless, I do find that there's a really interesting sort of like a Venn diagram overlap of where our work is really going to find a kind of productive point. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, dude. I think that, people who listen to the podcast probably think that we think the same things because we agree a lot. And certainly politically, I think we are mostly we're agreed on almost everything, probably, at the general level, at least. We have very divergent sort of areas of interest in the broader academic sense. And I like it so much because we sort of helped form each other in our early sort of theoretical and intellectual years, in our late teens, early 20s. I don't think we're ever going to diverge at that like moral, political kind of foundational level of what drives us and what we care about. But we have these very different areas of interest in philosophy and in academia generally. And so it's always super interesting to me to see how you get into these areas of finance and economy and just talking about stuff. And I'm just like, what the fuck are you talking about? I have no idea what this is. And trying to kind of bring it back to that foundational, motivating set of concepts that I know you hold. And that is actually what helps me understand it, like in a hermeneutic sense. Because I can see where you're coming from given the sort of starting point or the initial conditions that you have. So that's, I think, probably the coolest thing about having an intellectual friendship, right? Is you know the person at a level way beneath and more foundational than their intellect. And you can place their intellectual contributions, right, from the way they talk to what they write and so on and so forth, within that scope in a way you can't do when you're just reading someone's book and you don't know the person. And it's not just like some really kind of simple and naive, like I'm gonna do like an intellectual biography of you, right? Which usually ends up papering over all the discontinuities and all the complexities of someone's life. This is like actually understanding why someone cares about something, and that can add so much to what that thing is. And especially to its potential, right? Because you can see what the other person finds as potential in it, and that can kind of inflame it in you. And I think that's the coolest thing about doing this podcast.
And I just got a little teary-eyed there. Troy just broed out on me and got me all emotional and shit. Yeah, I agree. And I think it's really interesting. I think if you go back to our first episode too, and we didn't really know what we were doing with the podcast up until now, I feel like it's really like in the past year, whereas I feel like the podcast has kind of come into its own, and it's been so productive. Like not that it wasn't productive and then we didn't have interesting and maybe stimulating and maybe even important conversations prior, but for me at least, the past year has been so transformative. Like this podcast and this hour and a half that we get to chat each week about whatever topic it is that we're addressing is really, really helpful with formulating my thoughts moving forward. And I think and I hope that people who are listening also are kind of coming along this trajectory, because it's not like this is church where we have everything and we're just distilling this pre-established knowledge, but we're actually developing. And so there's like a flow, and I think it's going to be super interesting to see where things go forward, especially if you keep reading that fucking analytic shit, man. Then you're going to make me read some more analytic shit. We're going to be reading about like Martha Nussbaum and shit on the podcast. I don't know what we're going to be doing, but it's going to be really interesting to see how that stuff, informs my thoughts as well, And then I'm going to force you to read some weird shit on like financial derivatives from like an economic sociological perspective at some point. So.
Oh yeah, I have no doubt. Hey, I made you read McTaggart, man. You dug it, so don't even start.
I did, and I dug the Cohen book. Fuck, I dug it so much that I literally rewrote the last chapter of my book to engage with G.A. Cohen. So, yeah, really fascinating. Well, cool. Is there any last thing you want to say just about the Barber chapter, like in preparation for the next chapter, like where you think it's going next?
Yeah, I mean, I think the next chapter is about religion, right?
Yep.
Yeah, religion, and the last chapter is about secularism. So I think we'll just see how it seems like Barber has this kind of triad, right? Christianity transforms into religion, transforms into secularism. And he's going to want to talk about this same level of discontinuity between those three stages that he's talked about, this imminent discontinuity that we talked about in this chapter. So we'll just be ready to talk more about the idea of religion and problematizing that in a similar way as we problematized Christianity in Paul's thought here.
Cool. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Sweet. Now it's time for the final segment of the episode, the Sticky Leaves. This is where one of us gets to recommend something that is, or share about something that is giving us meaning in a world that might be devoid of meaning. This week it's Troy's turn. So Troy, what is your Sticky Leaf?
So last week, I spent each night watching an episode of a British show called Broken, starring Sean Bean. It aired last year, 2018.
Does he die?
I'll spoil it right now and say he does not die, either in the first episode or at all. So it's a huge break from his usual work.
No, I've not heard of the show.
So the idea is, it's from I forget the name of the writer, but he's kind of a long time British TV writer. I think he's written since like the 80s. He's very well known in British circles. I've never seen any of his shows because it's only in the last 10 years or so that British shows have kind of been made with a big time British shows at least have been made with a kind of universal English speaking audience. So I think his shows are very, very English typically. And this one is as well, although I enjoyed it a lot. The basic premise is Sean Bean plays a Catholic priest in a poor, somewhat ruralish area in England. And the name of the show is Broken because he himself has suffered through child abuse and sexual abuse growing up, and it eventually leads to him wanting to become a priest. Even though some of the abusers were Catholic priests themselves, so it's very timely in that sense. And he's dealing with a bunch of parishioners who are themselves extremely broken. And each episode focuses on a different broken person. And they deal with things from gambling addiction to poverty to abuse for being homosexual to police violence, all sorts of things, all of which are very timely given contemporary circumstances. And at first, this show was very critically acclaimed, and I think Sean Bean won the BAFTA for Best Actor for it. And he absolutely deserves it because he's incredible in the show. At first, I was frustrated with the show because as good as it is, and how well written as it is, and how well acted it is, it seemed like it was just tragedy porn. Like it was, here's an individual, here's how they're broken both by their experiences and by their societal circumstances, and everything sucks, and everyone's going to die, and everyone's going to be miserable, and religion can't do anything to solve it. And the parishioner, Sean Bean's going to try, and Sean Bean, right? You want to believe in him, and you want him to be your father.
Yeah.
And he's so kind and humble, and but at the same time has this inner strength, and you want to be like him, right? That's what Sean Bean always signifies. And the whole point of the show is it's not going to work. He can't resolve the brokenness in any of these people. And it was so hard to watch because you love it, and after you watch it, you're just like, shit, man, this sucks. And I was frustrated. And I don't want to say anything about the end, But if anybody was to watch this show, and I would certainly encourage anybody who can deal with some of those dark and deep topics to watch it, the way that the show ends was just so overwhelmingly beautiful. And I'm not going to say how it ends, but I'll just say the sixth episode, the last episode, is about him, Father Michael, played by Sean Bean, and that he's broken, which has been building up through the whole series. And part of his brokenness is the fact that he can't solve or resolve the brokenness in anybody else. And that's his whole mission, is to help them do that, but he can't. And ultimately, the whole thing just changes, and it's all about forgiveness. And the realization that brokenness can't always be resolved. And that sometimes that's okay. And what do you do with that? Is it just despair? Or is something about forgiveness a way that we can actually cope and deal with it? And it doesn't give any easy answers. It's not like a hand wavy, like, oh, forgiveness in the story of Christ or whatever will just resolve those problems for us and we'll be fine. It does not do that at all. But it hints at something promising about forgiveness as a resolution or some sort of way of dealing with brokenness. And I was just so moved by the end of the series. And I know for a lot of people it'd be difficult to watch a series and the first 5 hours are incredible but difficult and don't make you feel good. And then finally you get that sort of resolution in the sixth episode. That can be hard for some people who don't have the emotional patience maybe to deal with it. But I would encourage anybody who enjoys British shows or challenging shows or dark shows, especially dark in the sort of more emotional and spiritual sense, not necessarily dark like True Detective or something, to give it a try, because I don't think anyone's heard about it in America, at least.
Where did you see it? What service?
I don't remember. I probably saw it on Reddit or something. But I mean, I doubt you can find it anywhere other than through, the illegal means. But I'm pretty sure it's not illegal since it's not airing in the United States. Don't quote me on that. But I think you can do that if it's not actually airing anywhere in the United States, because no one in America has the rights to it, right?
I am not a...
Yeah, I'm going to say that it's possible. That's
copyright lawyer or IP lawyer, so I am going to say I don't know, Troy. I wonder if you could order it on Amazon or something like that. I don't know. Interesting.
Maybe.
Well, I mean, I give a fuck. Go do people do what you got to do to access the shit that you got to access. Okay.
Well, we are not encouraging any potentially illegal ways of.
But I'm also not discouraging you from being inventive. So, but no, I mean, that sounds really interesting. I think I'm always. It kind of. I mean, I know it's very different, but again, there's this type of drama that I love that deals with faith and crisis and existential concerns. I mean, that's why I love The Leftovers so much, which is one of my favorite TV shows I've ever seen. And I feel like it's unfortunate because people know about it, but it doesn't have the popular appeal because there aren't like boobs and fast cars, and there's nothing easy. And then even at an intellectual level, there's nothing easy about it. It leaves you at the end. Even I know some people are like, what the fuck happened in the last episode? Where I'm like, I love it because the mystery remains, right? That there's still uncertainty. There's still questions. There's still this discomfort that it leaves you with, which obviously as someone who's, a philosopher, I find very powerful and interesting. I think that's one of the great things that art can do. Not all art has to be that way. Sometimes it's nice to have a nice little bow wrapped around the end of like a Fast and Furious film or whatever. But
dude, what is it about American TV series and movies that just cannot deal intellectually or with depth with religious ideas or religious
I didn't want to generalize. I was going to say this, but I didn't want to do it.
It really is generally true. Everyone's just afraid to do it, even though way more people in America are involved in religious institutions than in somewhere like England. Yet England has all these really great, especially TV series, that deal in an important and secular way with religious institutions. It's so funny that America just seems incapable of doing that.
I mean, part of it is that I think there's an essential, like, easy hedonism that really characterizes much of American culture, which is that we need to have things that produce happiness, things that kind of have a nice little, a nice capstone to them, because that allows us to feel like we have managed the problem. It's like a form of risk management, actually, in cinematic form. But I also wonder if there's like a larger theoretical thing pertaining to how it is that we understand time and how it is that we understand and relate to the future in this. There's a sociologist named Elena Esposito, and I don't know if this demarcation is perfectly generalizable the way that she does, but there is something interesting in it where she says that the European conception of the future is much more about like you prepare in the present for the future, whereas the American conception of the future is that you take the future to prepare the present, and that there's this image of the future that conditions the present. And so I wonder if there's something about this in there as well, is that the future is already this realizable or realized thing, and then the things that we experience in the present are just kind of like instantiations of that. And so that creates a sort of like easy teleology, whereas there's an openness in the European idea that you're kind of just working in the present. You know, you're doing your best to mitigate potential problems in the future, but nevertheless, there's still an openness of the future.
And that was way more deep than I thought the issue was. I thought it was just because Hollywood hates religious people, but whatever.
I mean, that's part of it, you know. But that's why that's why Paul Schrader's First Reformed was such a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, exactly.
And why it probably didn't get the attention it deserved.
Yeah, I think even though it's definitely not in any way proselytizing, you just can't even allow the very idea of a story about religious people to receive awards. Like, even though it's such an obviously highbrow drama. Again,
I think that we've talked about this before, but there's this influence of like new atheism, and there's this resentment. It's like you either have hyper evangelical Bible thumpers, or you have like Bill Maher. And
exactly.
And it's really difficult for, like, do you know who Nathan Robinson is? The guy that runs Current Affairs?
No.
He was live blogging or live tweeting or whatever the Zizek-Peterson debate. And he says at the outset, he's like, I hate both of these men. So I was like, oh, great. So then why the fuck are you doing this? Just to be resentful and to hate tweet? Like, this is going to be a shit show of a blog. But I just briefly skimmed it. And a couple of the things that he said was, I mean, he was so uncharitable, even in his interpretation of Zizek. Because for him, it was like unscientific. And he's like this new atheist kind of guy. And the fact that Zizek is entertaining these like mystical ideas about ideology, and he talks about G.K. Chesterton, and he talks about God. For Robinson, that's all just nonsense, and it's just like brute science, right? It's like in the Chomsky-Zizek debate, Zizek is a charlatan, and it's all about like this rationality, this positivist rationality. That's the bad side of Chomsky, I would say. And a lot of that characterizes so much of like left and liberal discourse in America. And then the conservatives are all like, nah, man, like Jesus is God and angels are real and you're going to hell, you know? And obviously there is some gradation between there, but it's definitely the minority, especially thoughtful engagements with religion from the left. That is extremely minoritarian.
Yeah, I do wonder, and this is maybe just fanciful thinking, but I wonder if we had more really deep intellectual and sympathetic dealings with just religious culture in general, if there would be less of this market for the what was the movie about abortion clinics that just came out and made $1 billion?
Unplanned?
Yeah. If there'd be less of that happening, or Fireproof and stuff like that, which is obviously kind of like, just drivel.
Right.
Because there's obviously a market for dealing with religious people, institutions, ideas, all these things, and it's just not at all served by sort of the Hollywood institution or whatever. I knew a guy once who wanted to do something like this. He was kind of a somewhat liberal Christian. He worked in Hollywood. He produced a series and actually read the pilot and commented on it for him. No, you don't know who this guy is.
Oh.
And he wanted to. It was a series about a couple of pastors who get involved in all sorts of like sexual promiscuity, but then like one of them's a total cynic and the other actually kind of believes in what he's doing, but he has secret doubts. And it was sort of like an HBO prestige drama. It read almost like Breaking Bad or something. But it basically revolves around like pastors at a local church. And I thought, like, man, that would be so badass if this thing was made. Like, it's totally rated R. There's like nudity and sex, and everyone's dropping F-bombs all the time. But it like deals seriously with these people. It's not like purely cynical about them. That kind of thing just would never fly. I would imagine a Hollywood exec reading that and just their head exploding and just being like, this is incoherent.
Brother, there's this tension in Hollywood between the creatives and the executives. And the executives want to be creatives, and they think they're fucking creatives, and they're the ones with the money, and they can greenlight the programs. And when you sit there, I was sitting in a meeting with the president of alternative programming at NBC Universal, and I remember the fact that he could not understand this very simple premise for a sort of, it was a reality show idea that my partners and I were developing that also had a really sort of like social program element to it, where it's like making the world a better place, empowering people sort of thing. And the fact that he could not see that this wasn't like Shark Tank, which is what they were trying to replace at the time, because I think that it was like fizzling out. The fact that he couldn't see how this was like in that lineage meant that he just completely discredited it. And I was like, no, you don't understand. There's excitement and intrigue and drama, but then there's also this social element. And like his ultimate conclusion was like, yeah, it just... where does it fit into? Is it Shark Tank, or is it oh god, what was that the show where they like move that bus and then the house is created?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Oh, you don't know reality television. The people who are listening know what I'm talking about. But the fact that like, even though it wasn't like Shark Tank as much, but it was kind of in that wheelhouse. But because he just was like, bottom line is this, like, how is this going to appeal to the millions of people who love Shark Tank? And I'm like, well, this is how. And, it's so infuriating, which is why I love that HBO actually has a little bit more leniency. And part of the reason why I love the autonomy that Netflix gives, but there's just too much, man. Then there's too much, because then something like this does get produced on Netflix and it gets lost.
Yeah.
So that's my other frustration. Amazon and Netflix and now Apple are going to they're going to allow outlets for creatives to have autonomy in their creation, but it's just going to get lost in the fucking field, And then, I don't know.
We got to do, dude.
Jubilee!
You got to make Jubilee, man. I think
people who don't know, we have a TV show. We won't talk. I do too. We have a TV show that we're going to make at one point. People, don't worry. It's in our 10-year plan.
Your job is to get famous first, and then this can be your passion project.
Oh, God. Oh, I don't have time to get famous. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up the episode there. Thank you guys for checking out another episode. As we said at the outset, if you find value in what we're producing, if you want access to bonus content, we got a new episode that we're actually going to record right now, which will be released as this episode is released, so it should be live. We also have a newsletter that's going to be coming out actually, by the time this episode is out, the newsletter will be out, as well as the option to recommend topics for future episodes, which we have. We are fielding suggestions right now at patreon.com, so go over there if you are a patron. If you're not a patron and you want access to any of these benefits, go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn. Yeah, and then if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can, owls_at_dawn. Same on Insta. And you can email us at owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. What else am I forgetting?
Just one more thing, dude.
Oh, what's that?
Das Vidania, Mary Constance.